Hey, Chana, nice to connect with you again. Thanks for coming back on the show.
I'm looking forward to our chat.
Yeah, me too. I'm really actually most excited about bullshit busting, and that's pretty much what we're going to do today, which is awesome. So, we've connected before in a kind of BS busting manner. We'll have our previous episode for our listeners in our show notes. But today, our discussion is going to center around so-called processed foods and processed vegan foods in particular. And it's kind of a negative buzzword in the vegan community. I think there's a lot of black and white thinking around this term, like processed food equals bad, processed food equals evil, and there's like no nuance, there's no gray area. But as we both know, it is nuanced. It is more complicated than just black and white. And there's probably some angles that our listeners may not have considered before. So I'm really looking forward to diving in there. But first, I feel like you've been up to quite a lot since we last spoke, actually. You have a new show that I think debuted in spring. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about this?
Spring of this year. Yeah, I do a lot of writing, but I also really enjoy talking with people about, all of the issues that sources of confusion in the health advice, especially nutritionally, that we get out there in the media. So I started a show which I call Get Real Health. And the goal of the show is to provide expert advice on, topics of confusion. And so, I of course can't be an expert in everything. So I've invited on, different guests to speak to different topics where there is, where there's confusion and where I think science can really bring clarity to people. So it's all over the map. Basically, the topics reflect the things that I'm wrestling with in my own life a lot of the time. Some of it surrounds plant-based diets, but that's certainly not the only topic. We also talk about weight loss, areas where there's lots of fads and lots of hype. Talked about happiness even, because I happen to know a happiness researcher. So, anything that I might be thinking about. And of course, you've done a lot on COVID because that's also been on my mind and people's minds. So I've been really lucky and grateful for my academic network to be able to have some really great guests that can speak to these topics in gory detail. So
that's amazing.
Yeah,
that's
what
cool.
I've been doing. I'm really enjoying it.
So we're going to link to that, by the way. So we will have that in our show notes as well. Is this in video or podcast form? Or are you doing both?
It's
What's
both.
The situation?
So you can find it on YouTube. You can also find it on, Spotify and Apple Podcasts.
Awesome. Very cool. Well, congrats. That sounds like an amazing project.
Thanks. Yeah, I really enjoy it.
That's so cool. Okay, well, let's dive in. So we have a lot to cover in this processed food realm. Such a buzzword. Now, I think part of the problem here, part of the challenge with this is the term processed does not, as far as I know, have a universal definition. So why don't we start there? How do we define it? How would you define it? Where do we even start?
Well, basically, it tends to be defined at the highest level as any food that's been altered from its natural state. And
so isn't that like most foods?
Yeah. I mean, unless you're just literally chowing on your garden or just biting into a cow, you are eating something that is altered. Or eggs, I guess. You just grab it out of the chicken and there you go. So yeah, I mean, not every food is altered. Although if you want to get really nuanced, even washing your food is processing. So most of us do some form of processing. So it is definitely a continuum. And there have been a lot of efforts, and different people have reached different, have achieved or promoted different classification systems to try and make it more meaningful and more linked to health.
Right. Okay.
So one classification system that has, some traction is it's called NOVA, and they have 4 categories of basically completely unprocessed, minimally processed, standard processed, and processed, and then ultra processed. So you hear a lot about the term ultra processed. Yeah. So that's and when you go through that classification scheme as an example, you might say, minimally processed foods are still recognizable from their source. Processed foods combine differently minimally processed foods, and then ultra processed foods combine a bunch of ingredients that are unrecognizable from their source already, and then you make it a completely unrecognizable from its source food.
Got it.
But the, you know, as we'll get into, none of those classification systems really explicitly speak to the nutritional content or the health profile of that food. They just speak to how that food was generated. And they're all arbitrary, and they all recognize their arbitrary nature, but oh, sorry, I got something weird. I tried to click.
That's okay.
Anyway, so any food classification system for processing is arbitrary because there is such a continuum. There's, you know, there are different types of processing. There's, again, there's washing, there's processing that's done to increase storage, there's processing that's done to increase nutrient content, to remove bad things, to add vitamins. There's such a huge range of type of processing that are done. It's almost impossible to develop a perfectly meaningful system using only one dimension.
That's a great point. But in the scheme of things, not just in veganism, but I think just like in popular culture, in talking about nutrition in general, the term processed has a pretty bad reputation. Like it's got this negative connotation. So where does that piece come from?
Yeah, I've actually been trying to unpack that a little bit. I'd like to dig more into the history of it. Just off the top of my head, I think that the butter versus margarine is probably a really pivotal point in the whole narrative of, you know, processed foods are bad and the natural alternative is better. I don't know, actually. That's something I'd like to, I'm just trying to explore the history of food processing, because if you look, you know, back far enough, you see, you know, you think of things like canning and pasteurizing.
Good point.
Creating beer, creating cheese. These are all cooking, just using fire, right? And that's probably the first one. All of these are just versions of food processing, right? So I think, you know, most people are not going to tell you that cooking is bad. Oh, some people will tell you that you should only eat raw food, I guess. But
that's a whole other podcast episode.
Exactly. But yeah, I mean, food processing has a long history, and I think it's only really gotten a bad rap in the last couple of decades, I think, because the way it's been used has changed. And I think it probably started with convenience foods, like microwave TV dinners. I'm gonna guess that's where we started to see some skeptics, probably, that, you know. But prior to that, I mean, I think it would probably be pretty widely recognized that, you know, fortifying flours is a good thing, you know, in alleviating nutritional deficiencies. So I think there are some uncontroversial benefits in terms of, you know, risk of foodborne illness and increasing transportation, increasing storage. There's some benefits that are pretty indisputable. But I think it's probably the convenience food category that is the subject of most debate. And that category, I think what I hope to get into is it's a very broad category, just like the category of natural foods is a very broad category, including eggs and beef and milk and, you know, and kale.
Yeah, right. That's a great point. Yeah. And I think what you're saying about the convenience foods, I mean, that's kind of, I mean, I haven't really looked at this super in depth, but that was my assumption, essentially, that when the average person thinks about so-called, quote, processed food, it's usually packaged. It's usually full of things like sugar, refined products like wheat, and it's usually not something we think of when we're thinking about nutrient density. But as you just mentioned, it's not a catch-all situation. That doesn't necessarily, like, the definition of processed, as you mentioned, does not inherently include nutrient density or healthiness. Yeah.
So I like to think, just, I guess, you know, just to sort of be clear, my goal is not to tell people eat more processed foods. Right. My goal is to tell people to think in a more nuanced way about excluding all processed foods being the key to health, and the impact that message may send. There are a lot of layers to it, in terms of just food security, and there are a lot of people who raise the point that this is sort of an elitist and can be elitist and bit of value judgment, because, you know, having some convenience actually is important for a lot of families. Don't have necessarily the time and resources to prep everything from scratch. Just to think more broadly about it. But for example, again, foods that are processed, I think when I think about it, is to me, it's more important, what is the goal of the food? Because foods are processed to achieve the goal, achieve a certain goal, right? And I think a great example is infant formula. It's totally, it would definitely fit the definition of hyper processed. You know, it's not really recognizable, the source ingredients, but the goal of that food is to nourish a growing baby, and it achieves that goal. My own children were a mix of breast and formula fed. And yeah, breast milk does have some advantages over, you know, formula can't recapitulate the sort of antibodies and the immune benefits. And I've actually written about some of this in detail, but to proceed to assume that it's toxic because it was engineered in a lab is just not accurate. So I think it really speaks to, when you get into it, the real problem with, like, we do see across population studies an association between greater consumption of ultra-processed foods and obesity, cardiovascular disease, hypertension. Those links exist, but they exist because of the specific, because of the specific nutritional content and attributes of most processed foods. So, and those specific attributes, high in total fat, high in calorie density, low in nutrient density, typically often high in saturated fats, often high in sodium, often low in fiber. So they have certain attributes that often make them prone to overconsumption. And then there was an interesting study that, you know, basically demonstrated in a controlled environment that similar macronutrient profile foods, even when consumed, when people were given a choice about how much to eat, they would just eat more of the hyper processed ones. So there are a couple layers to it. So one is the differences in nutrient content, and the second is the way that the structure of the food actually impacts. And, you know, more refined food is often more digestible and will maybe hit your bloodstream faster because it's essentially pre-digested in a way. So there are some attributes of those foods that are actually different, but they're not uniformly the same across all ultra-processed foods. So when you're thinking about it for your own consumption and the way that you're talking about it and judging others for what they eat, it's important to be more nuanced.
Absolutely. We'll get into that in more detail and how that relates to the vegan community as well, which I'm looking forward to. But it does remind me, our previous episode where we talked about Impossible Burgers, Beyond Burgers. I actually just mentioned this on a recent podcast, I think with Devin, where we got a lot of feedback from listeners just immediately assuming that we want everyone to eat these foods. It's like we are advocating you must eat Impossible Burgers just because we're talking about it. We're now apparently, you know, advocating that all of our listeners should eat these foods. And so the point that you made about processed foods is we're not saying you need to eat more of them necessarily. We are just saying it's not a black and white situation. It is more nuanced. There are more angles to this than the average media message is giving us. And so we want to dive into some of these nuances.
Yeah, and I think it's actually much more productive to ask yourself, what are the criteria of a healthy or a more healthy food? And so when you're navigating the choices that are out there, whether that's a whole food or whether that's a processed food, you can apply those criteria to make choices that,
good point,
leave you in a better nutritional place.
Well, so on that note then, and we'll come back to the kind of black and white thinking in a bit. On this note though, how do you assess the healthiness of a food, whether it's processed or not? I mean, like, what are some of the factors that we can use to make this judgment? Yeah,
well, if you look at some of the studies trying to either prove or disprove that processed foods are healthy, what they typically do is they say, how much do they provide of the nutrients that we tend to underconsume and we know we should be eating a lot of, like fiber. So you want to look at how much do they provide of the good stuff. How nutrient dense are they essentially? Are they providing a lot of vitamins and minerals and a lot of fiber and whatever macronutrients you might need? And then you look at how does that compare? Do they have any negatives? What are the relative amounts of the things that we want to maybe minimize and just be mindful of? So Typically that's saturated fats and sodium. Those are the two. So if you look at one of these scientific studies, they basically say, well, do processed foods, according to whatever definition they're looking at, tend to have more saturated fats, lower, more, how do they do according to those things that we want and those things that we don't want to have too much of? And the answer sort of, you get actually slightly different answers depending on the analysis. So some researchers will tell you, in general, saturated, highly processed foods do contribute, make an outsized contribution to our sodium and our saturated fats, and they under contribute to, fiber and vitamins and minerals. But according to other definitions, you get a much more heterogeneous and not so clear-cut picture. So it depends on how you define it, and it depends. Yeah,
the answer is often it depends.
Yeah, it's always it depends. But yeah, so when I for example am shopping for, if I want to maybe try a vegan cheese, I'm going to look at the nutritional profile. I'm going to look at how much saturated fat, how much sodium, how much fiber. Same things I would look at if I'm just shopping for crackers for my kids.
Sure.
And relative ratios of protein to whatever. I mean, and as I'm sure you know, if you're looking at them from the macronutrient side, it's more about your day than about that one food.
Exactly.
So if someone's eating fruit all day, then they probably want to get a lot of protein in their dinner, and they might want to get some fat too.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
So it also depends on individual goals.
Yes.
Individual goals,
definitely.
and also individual diet patterns. So like, for example, if all you're eating is fruit all day, you probably need something a little higher in protein and fat than somebody who has already been eating protein and fat throughout the day.
Exactly. Yeah,
that makes sense. So speaking of these vegan protein sources, it's always about the vegan protein. Where do these vegan processed foods fit in? A lot of them are high protein sources. Not all of them, though. You mentioned vegan cheese.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of options like the faux meats and the seitan and all these kind of like fake meat things. Where do those fit in with this whole discussion?
They actually vary a lot within the category. I grabbed a few out of my fridge actually, because my husband, he's actually a perfect example to consider as someone where these fake meats play a useful role, because he is, he's vegetarian, not vegan, and he's actually pescatarian. He will eat seafood. So we've moved him along, a little ways.
That's good. Yeah.
So we've been together 20 years, and he's moved from, growing up on Taco Bell to, being pescatarian.
That's great.
So that's good.
Yeah.
I'll take that.
Move in the right direction.
And for him, if he didn't have his fake meat products, I think he would have a lot harder time adhering to our vegetarian, so our family, even though I'm plant-based, our kids are vegetarian because he can't live without cow milk and cow cheese. So he's going to be putting it on top of things. And I don't tend to serve it to my kids, but when he has it, they're like, I want what he has. I want Parmesan on top of my pasta or whatever. And anyways, I think these products, just sort of health aside, I think they play an important role for people who do crave the taste and texture and sensation of meat. I don't happen to crave it and miss it, but he does. And for him, it provides an important replacement. So we have them. Anyways, long story short, we have them in our fridge, and they vary a lot. So I just grabbed a couple examples.
Sweet. Okay.
We like these field roast sausages. So my son likes these as well. It's funny because my kids have never had meat, and so it's interesting to see how they react to different fake meat products, because they don't really have.
They don't have a comparison point.
Yeah, and some of them they like my son really likes these. My twin, so my son's 9, he likes maybe like half of the fake meat products. He likes most of them, but some of them the really more meaty beef patties, he's not a huge fan of. He'd rather have a bean burger, but he does like his veggie sausages. My twin girls, who are almost 5, they've never had meat either, and they don't really like any veggie burgers, but they do like the fake chicken nuggets. And the breadedness, I think, of it is what they like. So so I have lots of experience shopping for these products because they play a role in my family's in my family. So okay, so we've got when I look at this, I see, okay, this has got it's got a good fat profile. It's got quite a lot of fat, 11 grams of fat, but most of that is unsaturated, so that's good. It's got only 3 grams of fiber. So this is what typical of these products have. They're fairly high in fat. They tend to be pretty low in fiber. And then for me, the one that usually raises the red flag is sodium. So, but they vary a lot from product to product. So this one has 550 milligrams in a single sausage.
That's quite a bit.
That is a lot. So I never let my son have more than one at a time,
right?
Because of that.
But the protein content in those field roast things
is 11
off the
grams.
charts. It's pretty good.
This one's, that's 11. Yeah, the protein is 22.
Yeah, so that's pretty good. So it's got twice as many grams of protein as it does fat, which is pretty okay for a faux meat product.
So let's put a Beyond Burger in there for comparison. Beyond Burger, we've got so this sausage here was 240 calories. So the Beyond patty here, 270 calories, has got similar amount of protein, 20 grams, but it's got 19 grams of fat versus the 11 in the sausage.
Right, interesting.
So yeah, that's because they're trying to replicate 80-20 beef. So 20% fat beef. That's the most common ground beef most common form of ground beef consumed. And so they basically reverse engineered to have the same amount of fat as a fatty, juicy beef burger. So that's why they have so much fat.
And so how much of that is saturated?
So in the Beyond, it is 6.
That's also quite a bit.
Yeah, and I know Impossible has a tad more, but the sodium here is 340, so it's less than the sausage. So on the saturated fats, I wanted to say something because Impossible Burger has 8 grams of saturated fat, whereas a beef burger has 9. The thing is, we could have a whole conversation about coconut oil as a saturated fat, because it is a different saturated fat. It's from coconut oil. And I don't know if have you ever talked about coconut oil on your show before?
Not exclusively. It's come up in kind of discussions about other oils, but not super in depth. So
spoiler alert, it's not a superfood. It's not, shouldn't be your go-to because it is very high in saturated fat. So I've got some coconut oil here, which I use occasionally, but not going to randomly add it to things just for the heck of it. 1 tablespoon of coconut oil has 14 grams of fat, of which 13 is saturated.
Ouch.
So if you are freaking out about 8 grams of saturated fat in an Impossible Burger, I'm sorry, but you've got 13 in a tablespoon of coconut oil. Or, say you like to make a coconut milk curry. It's the same stuff. It's the same saturated fat. 1/3 of a cup, 13 grams of saturated fat.
That's not a lot. 1/3 of a cup is easily in one serving with like veggie broth and stuff.
Exactly.
Huh.
So if you're worried about the saturated fat in one of these fake meat burgers, then you should be not eating coconut milk in your curries, because it's the same thing and you're probably getting more of it in your coconut milk curry.
Good point. Look at this hardcore bullshit busting.
There you go.
I love that you had all the products on hand, by the way.
Yeah. I also have, speaking of coconut milk, so let's look at some vegan cheeses, because I'm constantly looking for a vegan cheese that I love. I put in a plug. I love Blue Heron.
Blue Heron's amazing. And Karen has been on our show, who makes the Blue Heron cheese.
We need more of it, but I don't have it right handy. So I'll just like browse the grocery store, and if I see a new one, I'll grab it and try it. So most vegan cheeses, not Blue Heron, their first ingredient is going to be coconut oil.
Right. And so these are usually the cheeses that aren't cultured, right? They're kind of like replicating the stringiness or the meltiness or whatever versus the culture.
Yeah. So a slice of like most non-cultured vegan cheeses is 60 calories and about 4 grams of saturated fat. That's
quite a bit for one slice.
Yeah. And they have no protein either. They're just coconut oil plus foods, plus modified cornstarch or modified potato starch. Another one here, I haven't actually tried it yet, but I've heard that Miyoko's butter is amazing. So I've
heard good things. I think a lot of it is made with cashews, isn't it?
Well, no, actually ingredient 1 is coconut oil, followed by water, followed by sunflower oil, followed by cashews.
Okay. So they're in there somewhere.
So when coconut oil is your first ingredient, so 2 tablespoons, 60 calories, 5 grams of saturated fat. And then let's just compare to some dairy cheese here, just because my husband won't eat anything else. 1 3-centimeter cube, which is basically a generous slice. Like if you get a slice, one of those pre-slices, it's a little over 100 calories, 10 grams of fat, of which 6 is saturated.
So these are all kind of comparable.
Yeah. Yeah. And the thing is, they're comparable by design, because saturated fats have impart a distinctive mouthfeel, that sort of creaminess of saturated fats, and they help, and they cook, they impact the way it cooks. So that's why Impossible Burgers and Beyond Burgers add them. If they only cared about, if health was the only criteria and they didn't have to replicate meat, they wouldn't add them, but they have to make it meat-like.
So again, we need to think about the context here in trying to assess where these so-called processed vegan foods fit in, for example. If, for example, like your husband, we are eating a Beyond Burger instead of a beef burger, even if the health aspect is kind of the same, which it probably is pretty similar, you've got the environment, you've got all the things we talked about in our other show, ethical reasons, obviously.
Yeah.
But it's not always purely about health. And I feel like in the vegan world, there's this whole concept of if you're not 100% whole foods, no oil, etc., then you're not doing veganism properly. And so again, that's like this black and white thinking, and it's so often tied with processed food, and especially all those products you just brought up, you know, like they're kind of seen as transition foods, unhealthy options. So like, this is a problem here. What are some of your thoughts on this? Like 100% whole foods is the only way to be vegan, and all processed foods are evil.
I think it's really off-putting, and I think it really does the vegan community a disservice to say you can't be here unless you're this way, and anyone who might take a step in that direction is sort of gonna feel, if people send the messages that's all or nothing, then people are going to choose nothing.
Right. That's a good point.
So I do think that, you know, mostly whole foods, plant-based diet is, you know, hard to beat health-wise.
Absolutely.
But the difference between that and one that adds a little bit of fake cheese, you know, coconut oil fake cheese or coconut oil fake beef, I don't see it being a big difference. That, you know, the slice or patty or whatever that you have once or twice a day, I honestly don't see, if, you know, the other 95% of your diet is meeting your fiber requirements, you know, very nutrient dense, I don't see there being a distinct health difference between the two.
Right.
That's, to me, that's a stretch. Just FYI, a tiny update on the plant-based foods. There was the first human trial of beef versus plant-based foods. So there was a
similar
trial,
plant-based foods, like beef versus like a Beyond Burger.
Yeah, it was actually sponsored by Beyond Meat.
Oh, okay, right.
And so, but it was done by a researcher at Stanford who I really like, Christopher Gardner, and is very upfront. So they just gave them tons of money to do the trial. But you know, when it was a properly designed trial, in that you have to pre-specify what success looks like, and you have to blind them and all this. It was randomized, controlled, and crossover trial. So I think it was 8 weeks on each diet. And so it was a crossover trial, which means that people spent 8 weeks on one diet, then they switched to 8 weeks on the other. And the intent was to only switch the meat and leave the rest of the diet constant. So they provided them a variety of different fake meat options. So they could choose the chicken or the beef or whatever, but they are all made by Beyond Meat. And they tried to have so that the total intake of, you know, protein and major nutrients were comparable, I guess, because, you know, these mock meat products do tend to match very similar nutritionally. And what the study found was, it was interesting. They chose as their primary endpoint TMAO. I don't know if you've talked about that at all.
No, I don't think so.
It's a metabolite that, so when you ask the question, you know, why is red meat associated with poor health outcomes? We don't really have great randomized control trials. It's very hard to do those most of the time in a diet, to only change one thing and to do it for 20 years and all that stuff.
Yeah,
but
of course.
There's a lot of epidemiological evidence, you know, to red meat having some downsides. Anyways, so one of the mechanisms is thought to be that red meat contains higher levels of choline, which is then metabolized in your gut to produce TMAO, when TMAO levels are associated with cardiovascular risk. It's kind of, anyways, it's a small molecule that's supposed to be, it's one of the hypotheses for why there might be harms to eating red meat. Anyways, so they measured TMAO levels, and they found, it's a kind of a funny story, because they found that the levels of TMAO did correlate, but only in one group. So those that were eating a plant-based diet first and then meat. There was a difference basically in whether you were eating plant-based diet first and switched to meat, or whether you're eating plant meats first and switched to real meat. Now I'm getting confused about which direction was which, but the idea is that if you don't actually have, so this TMAO is a sort of is a positive cycle where if you consume more red meat, you generate more of the microbes that produce TMAO. And therefore, when you eat red meat, you'll produce more TMAO. Whereas if a plant-based person ate red meat, they wouldn't have the microbes to make TMAO, at least initially. So they wouldn't see much TMAO when you went from eating plants to when you went from eating meat. So now that's probably the direction it was. Yeah.
Okay.
Anyways, it was a bit funny to me that they chose TMAO as what's called their primary endpoint. So it's sort of the success make or break. Anyway, so they found an interesting sort of provocative finding in TMAO. It wasn't, dramatic. And again, TMAO is just a hypothesis that is somewhat controversial, but that was their primary endpoint. And then they measured as secondary endpoints, they measured a bunch of things like weight change and LDL cholesterol levels and, glucose, markers of glucose metabolism, sort of insulin resistance, a few things. And the only thing that was really stood out, they found like 1 pound weight difference, which is nothing. And even though it was statistically significant, it's probably noise. And even the investigator says that, but they did see a lowering in LDL cholesterol levels. And that's sort of the one that I expected to see, because Beyond Burgers do have about half the saturated fat of a beef burger. So I'm not surprised that you saw a bit of a lowering in LDL cholesterol. Anyways, this was a very long tangent. All to say is the healthiness of a food is, we'll learn that from human trials, but you can make predictions saying, well, in general, when you reduce saturated fats and replace it with unsaturated fats, you tend to see a lowering in LDL cholesterol, and that tends to translate to lower cardiovascular risk. But at this point, we have a little bit of an encouraging thing we can point towards saying, that you do see this difference from swapping, at least from beef to plant-based. So back to what you're saying, it all depends on what you would be eating otherwise, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, you're not going to sit there, hopefully, and eat a diet 100% of Beyond Burgers, right?
Yeah.
I would hope.
That would not feel good.
Yeah. And also you would not want to be part of a trial that does like the Beyond only diet for a month and then switches to like a meat only diet. So yeah, of course, the context is huge, as you mentioned. Yeah. And plus there's like non-health things too to keep in mind, right?
Yes.
Like, why are you eating this? But sorry, what were you going to say?
Yes, I was going to mention that in this particular trial, they had 2 servings a day.
Oh, wow.
So this is that's if you go
almost like a Beyond all the time diet.
Yeah. So I do think that from a health perspective, the idea that switching to one of these burgers is a bit, is going to be dramatic.
Yeah.
Is overstated, especially if you're going to have the same toppings, which contribute probably 2/3 to 3/4 of the calories and of the sodium and of the
good point.
The rest of the meal. Yeah.
That's a good point. So let's transition a little bit, because related to all of these Beyond Burger, Impossible Burger, processed foods, there's also something that we were going to discuss related to GMO and bioengineering. And I know that there's a new label out there that I believe you mentioned Impossible has willingly adopted, which is not GMO, but bioengineered, right?
Yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit about this? Because we're going to talk about how more foods than we think are probably created from this process and whether it's safe and all this stuff. But what is bioengineering?
Yeah, so the bioengineered food label, it's actually, it's a pretty nuanced definition, but I think the intent is primarily to focus on foods that have a sort of a GM crop underlying them.
Okay.
They actually carve out exceptions for what I think are just as an exciting and important use of genetic technology, which is genetically engineering microbes in order to produce ingredients. So as a scientist, I would view that, cheese, the production of cheese, for example, is one of the is one that people use as an example that, genetically engineered microbes are used to produce an enzyme that is important for cheese making that would otherwise require, calf stomachs.
Right.
The enzyme chymosin that is the active ingredient in rennet. So, but cheese does not get labeled as bioengineered because it's used as an ingredient in the processing, and so there's lots of discussion in those guidelines about whether or not there's detectable genetically modified DNA in the food. It's interesting that a lot of when we think about genetically modified foods, mostly what we eat, a lot of what we eat that originates from genetically modified foods actually has no DNA in it. So, for example, soybean oil. So oil from genetically modified soy, you're just eating the oil. There's not even any DNA in it. But something that has genetically modified soybean oil, I need to double check. I believe it would have to be labeled. That's a good question. But when we think of GM soy, most of the time we're not eating a soybean. We are eating some purified product of that, and often there's not even any DNA in it. So, anyways, there's the bioengineered label doesn't really satisfy anyone, because those that want full disclosure, they're going to say it's not what's the word? It doesn't disclose everything where there was genetic engineering used in the process upstream somewhere. And that's what some, really hardcore advocates would say. Even if there's no DNA in the food, I don't like the idea that something was genetically manipulated earlier in the process. And there are actually others that might say it's, maybe shining a light on things that just don't make sense scientifically and don't actually have a reason to be concerned, which is,
well,
I have mixed feelings about that. I don't really know what
yeah, it's one of those things where
I don't know what the optimal bioengineering label would be. We keep talking over each other. Go ahead.
No, it's cool. Isn't like 90% or like 85% of corn in the States essentially GM, and like 90% of canola is GM?
Yes.
And mostly how we consume these things are oils and not corn and canola in whole form, I would assume. But so how is the term bioengineer different from GM, genetically modified? Is it a type of GM?
Honestly, it's just they're almost interchangeable.
Okay.
It's just I don't say branding or marketing. I feel like people didn't want to use the word GM, so they wanted to use bioengineering. Just sounds more favorable, and it really there does have to be genetic engineering involved to get a bioengineered label.
Okay.
Yeah. So everything with that label will have genetically engineering using, but not every type of genetic engineering requires slapping that label on it.
Interesting.
Does that make sense?
So you mentioned because
there might be no DNA left in the product, for example, right? It's just if it was part of the food production versus the actual food you're eating has altered DNA in it.
Right. Okay. So you mentioned as an example, like making rennet potentially vegan. Rennet is the calf stomach lining that's often used in cheese. And you also, when we were chatting beforehand, you mentioned yeast as an example. So is that something like using yeast to make insulin, for example? Is that considered bioengineering?
Yes. Yeah, this is where I actually think, it certainly is, whether in terms of the FDA food labeling, that's sort of a separate conversation. But I think what I would like to help open people's minds to is that we do already use genetically engineered microbes in ways that support environmental and sustainability goals and animal welfare goals. So the chymosin example for cheese is a great one. So one way that microbes are used is to produce enzymes. And enzymes, are used for industrial uses. And, if you didn't have the microbes, the genetically engineered microbes to make those, you would have to find a natural source and just grind it up and get it out, right? Whether that's an animal or whether that's harvesting an entire field of plants to get some trace ingredient, right? So it allows you to be a lot more efficient. So ways used now, for example, it's used in medicines, as people are maybe more familiar with that. So, insulin is an example where we used to like harvest pigs' pancreas to get insulin, and now you can just make it in a vat using a microbe. Similarly, so I used to work at Genentech. A lot of antibody therapeutics, like a lot of cancer drugs, are made using microbes to create the specific antibody. They're used for vaccine production. They're used in medicine, and we accept them there. But then when it comes to using them to make a food ingredient, people hesitate. But they are used already in ways that you might not recognize. For example, to make some of the vitamins that are used for fortification are very commonly produced in bacteria. It's efficient to do it that way. Similarly, sweeteners, it would be a good example, like stevia. You can either go grow and harvest a bunch of stevia, or you can just ask a microbe to make it, program a microbe to make it, and has a much lower, very different environmental footprint if you ask a microbe to make a specific thing versus harvest a whole organism for one tiny part of it, which is essentially, so from an efficiency perspective, that's why they exist, because they allow you to use, companies are going to do things the most efficient way. And a lot of times that means growing that one ingredient they want rather than harvesting the whole plant. So that's the Impossible Burger. That's sort of the story with their heme. And there's, some concerns that their heme is they're using this genetically modified concerning heme, but really they're using heme that is available in soy root nodules. So initially they were trying to harvest fields and fields of soy to extract this tiny ingredient from their roots. And then they thought, well, wait a second, why don't we just make that ingredient? Instead of growing a whole field of soy for something that is and they're in minute amounts. So I would just really like to help people shift their mindset. And I think if you can accept that microbes are useful to produce medicines, maybe you can accept they're useful to produce ingredients in your food that are often exactly identical to the natural version, but just more efficient to produce.
Mm-hmm. That's a really interesting
point. If you can accept that, if you can accept that, what's so different about a genetically engineered microbe versus a plant? Again, usually with a goal of some sort of more efficient, usually the goal for engineering plants, it's often an herbicide or pesticide equation, but to me, it's just a toolkit, right? It's just a tool. And why would we limit our toolkit if we have the possibility to do things more sustainably in a lower environmental impact way? That's not to say that every GM has that benefit, but it's a tool that in theory could produce that benefit. And I think every GM crop needs to be evaluated, on its own merits compared to what the alternative is. And if it offers advantages, then go for it. If it seems like a net negative, there's gonna be a bunch of different axes to consider, then don't. But it's just a tool, right?
Right. That's a good way of looking at it. And I think people might be surprised how many foods, like the vitamins you mentioned, things that are fortified, how many foods we're currently consuming that involve these processes. And also that, it's again, this whole black and white thinking, right? Where bioengineered or GM is always evil, kind of like the processed food thing, right? But it's nuanced. And you mentioned a lot of interesting points around efficiency and how in a lot of cases, maybe this bioengineering is in fact better for the environment, more ethical in an animal agriculture kind of context, and gives you the exact same result. So how do we know that these things are safe? Have there been lots of tests? Like what's the safety? Because there's a lot of people who are like immediately red flag, right?
Yeah. Well, I think when you produce something from bacterial, so I brought up yeast because when you're creating something using microbes, you can either use bacteria or yeast and just grow them in a vat and manipulate their DNA to crank out whatever you want them to crank out. And then, you're in the driver's seat, right? You're choosing exactly what you're producing, and then you just there's no reason you can't create the exact same chemical you find in nature, right? we all have the same genetic code. So yeast and bacteria can read the same genetic code that plants and animals have. So that's kind of why it works. You just insert a gene from something that another source, and they read that gene because they speak the same language. They have the same genetic code. And then they purify it. So I think if you're producing the exact same ingredient that we've always consumed, it's almost silly to worry. But I mean, of course you want to check purity, but it's something you've already consumed, that you're used to consuming. Then the only question is, are you consuming? I think you get into trouble. You can potentially get into trouble. So the safety risks are higher in 3 situations. One, if you're consuming something at much higher doses than humans have ever consumed, and then you have to do some animal studies to make sure that these doses are not a problem. Second is, if related to that, is there an allergenicity issue? So with the Beyond burgers, because the pea protein there, people are, if you're allergic to legumes, you need to be aware that, you know, if you have a pea protein, you could be reactive to that. So you need to be aware of allergy issues. You need to be aware of just dose issues, or like, are we consuming something at unusual doses that could start to cause problems you've never seen before? The third thing is just, it is a different story, and you do need especially rigorous testing if it's a brand new ingredient that's never been seen before. And I think like the fact that the partially hydrogenated oils and trans fats are an example of that, where we were, I don't actually know the details of how the whole margarine story unfolded and why we weren't able to flag that earlier, that consuming that novel fat structure would be an issue. But a lot of the things that we use genetically engineering for now in microbes are just the same things that we know are safe, but we're doing them in a different way rather than having to go through growing at something, purifying it, and isolating it.
Interesting. So it's like getting rid of the middleman, basically. The middle process. Interesting.
Yes.
Huh. Okay. So there's a lot of nuance in all of these.
I feel like my computer's getting, sorry, I'm gonna, 1 second.
Yeah,
I
no
feel
worries.
like my computer's humming a lot. It's like,
oh, no problem.
It's heated up, so I don't want to be too noisy.
Is the fan on?
Yeah, and move it out of the way because it was humming. Oops. Did I change my perspective too much?
No, we're good.
Do I look the same?
You look great.
Okay.
All good. Yeah, so there's a lot of nuance in context, again, when we talk about like why something might be produced by microbes versus getting it from the source, so-called quote source, which might not be as effective. There's a lot of nuance when we think about processed food as well, and whether it's healthy, whether it's safe. We have to take into consideration so many different contexts: the context of the rest of our diets, the context of our own health goals, our lifestyles, all these kind of things. So if you could kind of sum up what we've talked about, I mean, I think one of the themes here is like non-black and white thinking and non-all or nothing thinking. But what would you say is like something that you would like our listeners to think about more, or something that you kind of see as a theme in what we talked about today?
That is a tough one because we have gotten all over the place.
I know.
I think non-black and white thinking is a big one. And the second one is just being open-minded to what technology can do. That technology is not necessarily a bad thing. I think it's useful to, for example, look at textiles. You know, is natural cotton is awesome, but my son just got a Gore-Tex jacket and it is the best. So I think there's almost this feeling that we should never even try to improve on nature, and we should never, that synthetic, you know, is always inferior. But I just try to be open-minded and think sometimes we can actually do better than nature. Nature, you know, I think there's another layer that we haven't talked about, which is what are some of the underlying beliefs that lead us to this whole versus process divide. And one of them is this idea, similar to the paleo diet, that whatever we've eaten historically must be the best diet.
Right.
And I don't think we can really say that even. You know, our food supply didn't evolve for us. It's a very egotistical view to believe that plants are optimized for our nutrition. It's just, that's not what they're optimized for.
That's a great point.
So yeah. And my husband actually did his PhD in evolutionary biology. So he often catches sort of the public conversation making just sort of illogical errors on how we think about evolution. We're just very self-centric when we think about how things are optimized, and assuming they're optimized for us. The world, the whole planet is not optimized for us. And similarly, my husband's dad is a botanist, and so he always brings it back to the plant perspective. The plant is trying to get you to eat it and spread its seeds. It's not trying to nourish you necessarily, right? So anyways, I would just encourage open-mindedness about technology in general. And you accept it in so many other areas of your life. Why don't you accept it in food? And I think some of that is because this belief that the way the nature is must be best for us, because it's always been that way.
Yeah, back when they had a life expectancy of like 26. We should do a podcast episode on this whole concept, because there's so much in there that is not even all just related to food, but this whole concept of untouched nature is the best and only option, and anything that deviates from it is inherently inferior. We could do like a whole series on that. I think that'd be so awesome. But why don't we leave it there for today? And so I would love to have you back on the show for more discussions about nuance and research and technology and food. But for now, where can our listeners go to connect with you, to check out your show that you have going on? What's the best method for them to get in touch?
Yeah, the best one stop shop is my website, which is fueledbyscience.com. And on there, you will find my articles, links to my podcast and YouTube. I also posted some of my favorite recipes, which I do less of these days, but I try to share, what I eat, which is mostly whole food plant-based, but that doesn't mean I don't enjoy some processed foods too. So yeah, that's the one stuff. And then, there's also links from there to my social profile. So Fueled by Science on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. All of that's linkable on my website, as well as my somewhat irregular newsletter, sporadic, I should say,
that's
newsletter.
Awesome. Yeah.
It comes out with a little bit of what I've been working on.
Excellent. Well, we'll link to your site, and also we'll have separate links to your socials as well. But Chana, thank you so much for coming back on the show. Great to have you. We are definitely going to do more episodes, because I feel like there's a lot going on in this realm that we could talk about, particularly related to your expertise. So thanks again. Much appreciated.
Definitely. Thanks for having me. Take care.
That was awesome. Sometimes after like 40 minutes, there's a bit of a lag in Zoom, but I think it's okay. It's all good. Sometimes we're like 2 seconds off, but it's all good. That was great. That was great. That's a lot of stuff packed into one conversation.
I hope it gives people food for thought.
Food for thought.
Yeah. I mean, I the thing I didn't say that I kind of wish is just at least to acknowledge, well, I think I did, but maybe to acknowledge that this whole foods are better is a useful rule of thumb. It's just, it just has its limitations, right? I mean, that's how I think about it. So it generally points us in the right direction, but not always.
So in what case we can add this as like a little bonus. In what cases, or what case would the whole foods only approach be detrimental or not accurate?
Well, if you're choosing beef, like if you're looking beyond plants, I mean, it's, to me, logically inconsistent to say whole foods are always better, but only in the plant kingdom, right? I mean, it's, and then I would say it also, so when might adding processed foods be a net positive? Probably just if you have any kind of intolerances that make it hard to get a certain group of foods, or if you have special needs, like I think protein powder is a hyper processed food. So if you have specific dietary needs that are not perfectly aligned with the average plant, then why not look to food technology to allow you to turn it up wherever you want to turn it up? It just allows you to be more tailored, right?
Right. And technically, if you're against any sort of processed food, then you're not taking your B12 supplement, which is super important, and your multivitamin, which not everyone needs, but maybe you do because you have a chronic disease or something where you need to boost certain levels, right? And actually, you mentioned allergies. As someone myself with major food allergies, I can't eat any nuts at all, except for peanuts. So in order for me to get my healthy fats, sometimes it's easier to just do a little like omega-3 supplement or something just to make sure, because I can't do walnuts.
Right.
I can't do pistachios, almonds, like all those things are off the table, right?
Yeah.
That's a huge food group that I need to replace.
Yeah, so, exactly. So basically to fill any needs that don't fit in your plant-based diet, either because of preferences or you just can't, some people just can't eat beans or like whatever it is, some gap that you struggle to fill either because of taste or because of tolerance, you can fill that. Food technology can help you fill that gap and just be targeted about what you want.
100%. I think we should include this as a little bonus.
Okay.
And also maybe we should do a whole episode on whole foods, the connection of like the whole oil debate, which we have not really touched on in much detail on the show yet. We've kind of surpassed it a little bit, but we haven't really delved in there. Have you done much looking in there, like what the deal is with the no oil folks?
Yeah. Do you follow this guy, the nutritional advocate, Alan Flanagan?
No. Maybe I should check him out.
I recommend him. You should check him out. And there's a podcast, Sigma Nutrition.
Oh, yes.
Have you heard of that one?
Yeah. Heard of that one. Wait, what's his name called?
He's
Alan Flanagan?
Yeah, he's on Instagram. He's called the Nutritional Advocate. And he partners with that guy from Sigma Radio, Danny Lennon. And they actually have a nice podcast episode all on the ins and outs of vegan diets and basically asking the question, how healthy are they? And, it's a very nuanced conversation, basically saying you can't just ask that. It depends on what version it is. And they examine some of the evidence on the whole foods. They look at some of the studies and they come down concluding that there isn't strong enough evidence to support the no oil proposition and that it's not an evidence-based position.
That is interesting because even
that's everything
as
that I've heard. And when I check,
yeah, that goes along with like, I haven't delved into it super in depth, but that's basically the sense that I get is like, there's nothing in the, like, there's no massive lit review looking at decades of research that is saying, we shouldn't have any oil at all.
Yes.
For everyone across the board.
Yeah, that's what Pamela Ferguson also, she basically says, if you want to eat no oil, that's fine, but make sure you're eating lots of avocado nuts. Like, she doesn't advocate no oil. She just says, make sure you get some fat. Yeah.
So someone like me who is allergic to avocado and nuts, like if I didn't do any oil at all, then I'd be kind of screwed.
Yeah. Yes. So I don't think there's no strong science singling out oil as somehow as villainous, Yeah.
We could do some more episodes.
And I think it's debatable what the optimal amount of fat is.
That's true. Cool.
I'm curious to know what the feedback is. I didn't say anything about did you, I can't remember if you said in my intro about my impossible connection. I don't know if I needed like a disclaimer, like I am personally connected to Impossible, but not financially or otherwise,
We can, if you like. We mentioned it in the previous episode,
yeah,
of course, because it came up with Pat. But yeah, in the previous episode, I think we explained like how you were.
Yeah, I feel it. Yeah. It might be nice to include it just because I feel like people, well, we didn't talk a lot about the burgers, but just in general, what's do I have any reason to be advocating for certain foods? Not really. I mean, for me, it might be worth saying in just a moment on the reason I've become pretty passionate about speaking up in favor of not demonizing processed foods is because I think they have an important role to play, especially in the vegan community. They can play an important role in reducing meat consumption in certain people.
100%.
Like and in improving environmental impact. Yeah. So that's why I speak up in favor of not taking a hardline view on them.
Absolutely. That makes sense. That's cool. Okay, well, I'll let you go, but I will, I'll follow up. I think this is going to come out pretty soon, actually. It might be a week from tomorrow. So I think it might be our next episode, actually. I've got 2 other interviews happening this week, but I'm pretty sure. I'll look at our calendar, but it's coming out soon either way. So if there is something that you want to add, we have all the info let me know. In your form, but let me know if there's anything else you want to like put into your intro or links to stuff. Because we'll be putting together in my bio, I did
actually, now that you mentioned it, I did say it. Yeah, no, I did say in my bio that I did my PhD with the founder of Impossible Foods. So that's probably enough.
I think that's good.
And I think, that should do it. And the fact that we did talk about how these foods play a role for people like my husband.
Exactly. Yeah. Awesome. Well, great to connect with you. Thanks so much.
So it's less, I guess it's
oh, sorry. Go ahead. We're on a delay again.
Take care. I was just going to say, I think it's actually even more important the way you talk about it than your own personal choice. Like, if, I'm more concerned about just the messaging and this perpetuating that it's bad than whether you avoid them yourselves. I don't care if anyone avoids them, but if you go out there and say they're bad, that's my problem.
That's a really good point. Maybe I should include that in the like preamble when I do the intro to you and your bio and stuff.
Okay.
Just as a kind of like setting the tone for this episode.
Yes.
That's a really good point.
Yeah, that's definitely, that's my purpose, is I'm much more concerned with the dialogue than I am about anyone's particular choices and trying to sway them.
Dialogue versus individual
trying to influence people's individual choices. Yeah,
I like that. That's awesome. Cool. All right, well, I will keep you posted. And let's chat on social media. I will let you know when the episode's out. And thanks again. It was great to connect.
Yeah, you too. Okay.
See you soon.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye.